All right, welcome back to Close Up, everyone. Republican presidential candidate Carly Fiorina, she knew coming into this primary that there'd be some work to do. She didn't have the name ID of a Jeb Bush or a Donald Trump and has never held elected office, but her credentials as a CEO and dogged determination on the campaign trail here in New Hampshire still have her right in the middle of things, and she's convinced she can gain momentum in these final weeks, and she's my guest this morning. Good to see you, ma'am. How are you?
Nice to see you, Josh.
How do you feel things are going? I mean, this has happened pretty quick, right? We're just a couple of weeks away from the primary.
Yes, we are, and so I'm really pleased. In yet another set of polls, I'm tied for 5th here in New Hampshire with a bunch of governors who have spent tens of millions of dollars here, and I haven't spent a dime yet. I'm even more pleased by the very robust ground game we have here, the number of great endorsements, including our state chairman, Ovid LaMontagne. You know, not a single vote has been cast, and the pundits have been wrong about this election from the very beginning.
Yeah.
So I'm counting on the people of New Hampshire to send me out of here with the wind at my back, and I think they will.
How accurate do you think these polls are going to actually reflect what we see on election night?
Well, you know, remember the election in Kentucky earlier this year, or last year? Well, there was a gubernatorial election in Kentucky. The polls, 24 hours before the election, were 17 points off. Right. So we know polls aren't accurate. If polls were accurate, we would have already had a President Hillary Clinton, and we would have had a President Rudy Giuliani, and we would have had a President Howard Dean. None of those things happened.
Sure.
But what I know, and I think what the people of New Hampshire know, is that the people of New Hampshire have a very important responsibility, and they haven't cast their votes yet, and probably 80% of them haven't yet quite made up their mind. Yeah, but they all know they want to see me debate Hillary Clinton.
Well, yeah, we're notorious for waiting to the last minute. The two names that people are talking about a lot, and this does include here in New Hampshire, obviously Donald Trump continues to be in the news, and Ted Cruz. First, what do you see as the difference between the two of them, and what do you make of the two arguments that they have? Are they similar? Are they the same candidate, just one of them wears cowboy boots?
Well, you know, what's similar about them is both Donald Trump and Ted Cruz claim to be outsiders, and both of them are the ultimate insiders. Ted Cruz has been inside the political establishment. Donald Trump has been a crony capitalist, buying influence from those inside the establishment all his life. He admits it. That's how he's raked in billions. And what they engaged in last night was a nasty fight about their own power and position. It had nothing to do with the American people, as this game of politics rarely does, unfortunately. It had nothing to do with providing solutions to our festering problems. You see, that's why people are sick of politics, and it's why I'm running for office. I think we have to take our country back. I think we have to restore a citizen government. The cozy little game that's been played for decades between the political class and crony capitalism has gone on for too long. And it's gone on in both parties. Yeah,
I mean, if you watch any of the debates, really, and you listen to some of the rhetoric, particularly on the Republican side of things, there's a lot to be afraid of, you would think. I mean, just, you know, if people want to just go inside and lock their doors. Is there a middle ground between the rose-colored glasses that a lot of Democrats are accused of wearing and some of the fear that some Republicans say that we really need to be considering? Or is it reality, what we're hearing more on the Republican side?
Well, look, people are frustrated. They're fed up, and now they're afraid. I mean, we've had 2 major terrorist attacks in this country since 9/11, and Hillary Clinton's talking about climate change and gun control. Yes, people are frustrated and fed up and afraid, and lecturing us about them, those fears, doesn't help. But we need to present solutions. I'm the only leader who knows how to solve these things. We need to cut our government down to size and hold it accountable. Finally, I will lead in the world as commander-in-chief and defeat ISIS. We actually need to restore possibilities in this nation. We can do all these things. It's silly to say that people don't have a right to be angry and frustrated. We are angry and frustrated. I am. But it's unproductive to just surf on that anger and never provide a solution. A leader provides solutions. That's why I've rolled out my blueprint to take our country back, and that's what I'm going to continue to talk to the people of New Hampshire about.
Now let's talk about guns. Obviously, a big issue here across the nation. From your standpoint, what is... Because gun violence is a problem. I think everybody can agree with that. But it's just what to do about it is where the disagreement lies. What is reasonable as far as what the federal government can do in terms of changing the law, whether it's background checks, investment in mental health? What do you see as a reasonable approach?
Let's start by the federal government enforcing the laws we have. We do a lousy job of that. We have lists of criminals who should not own guns and who do, and less than 1% of them are being prosecuted today. So let us take guns out of the hands of the people we know shouldn't have them. Let's have enough FBI and DEA and ATF agents to actually perform the background checks that are already lawful. That didn't happen with Dylann Roof, for example, in South Carolina. So when the President of the United States says, never mind that Congress twice on a bipartisan basis rejected what he proposed in executive order, he forgets how the Constitution works. But he also said, basically, we haven't been enforcing the law, so I'm going to start doing that now in the last year of my term. Let us start by enforcing the laws we have. It would make a big difference.
Sure, and I want to ask you about executive orders because you obviously bring a unique perspective to this campaign, having been the CEO of a major company. When is it appropriate, do you believe? I mean, I know candidates hate to hypothesize, but you must consider this, especially when we debate over what President Obama has done. When is it appropriate for a president to exercise an executive authority?
Well, you know, we have a blueprint that tells us. It's called the Constitution. It's called the Constitution. And the truth is, President Obama has collected vast amounts of power in the Oval Office, but so have Republican presidents. One of the things I believe is we have to restore a citizen government. We have to put power back in the hands of the people. And what does that mean? It means taking away the power of the executive branch to, for example, just roll out rule after rule after rule. The executive branch has been rolling out rules which now govern this economy and suppress opportunity and are keeping people out of work. And who are the rule makers in the executive branch? They're not elected. They're not accountable. They're bureaucrats with an ideology. So restoring a citizen government, taking our country back, starts with knowing what the Constitution says and then holding government accountable. And that means we roll back rules and we examine every dollar and we finally reform the tax code. All of these things are in my blueprint.
Yeah, we're at a stage of the game where most of the people know where the candidates stand on the issues. I want to ask you about something, though, because a lot of this campaign has been about attitude and going a little bit too far. You said recently during a debate, which drew some nervous laughter in regards to Hillary Clinton, at least I like to spend time with my husband. Is that sense of humor, or is there a point to be made when you say something like that?
Well, the point I was making is that Bill and Hillary Clinton have focused on gaining power all of their lives, both of them. And they've done it as a tag team. The Clinton Global Initiative is like a gigantic Ponzi scheme, selling access and influence. And Bill and Hillary Clinton sit right at the top of it. Hillary Clinton herself, but Bill Clinton as well. Well, let's just talk about Hillary. She's the one running. She's escaped prosecution more times than El Chapo. Maybe Sean Penn's waiting to interview her as well. This has all been about gaining power. And they'll do whatever they have to gain power, and they'll say whatever they have to say. Unfortunately, that doesn't help the American people. Not at all. The American people are tired of being told to sit down and be quiet. And they're tired of a nation where we have record numbers of men out of work still, and record numbers of women living in poverty still, and middle-class wages stagnating still, and no solutions. I offer leadership and solutions. It's time to take our country back.
Let me ask you about New Hampshire and what you got to do, because we are just about out of time. You know what the pundits say, and well, I'm glad I'm not a pundit. But you know, there's really very limited tickets out of New Hampshire. Maybe one of the governors. You have Ted Cruz. You have obviously Donald Trump. I mean, where do you think you need to finish to keep going?
I need to leave here with the wind at my back, and I think I will. I have exceeded expectations every step of this campaign. I started out 17 out of 16. Nobody'd ever heard my name. New Hampshireites had never heard of me. And yet they showed up and they listened. And now, as I said, I'm sitting where no one expected me to be. I trust very much that the people of New Hampshire take their citizenship seriously. And we're packing them in town halls because people know this country is at a pivotal and perilous time. It is time to take our country back. I think the people of New Hampshire know that, and I think they will have me come out of New Hampshire with the wind at my back.
One last question for you, and we'll see what happens in the next cycle, but there's suggestions of changing the selection process, one of which includes the idea of a regional primary, doing away with the early contest states. Does a Carly Fiorina, who you just admitted came into this thing with no one knowing who you are, can she even run in a race like that, do you believe?
Well, of course, the political establishment wants to take away power from the voters of New Hampshire. That's what this whole election cycle has been about. The political establishment has wanted to winnow the field as quickly as possible. That's not in voters' interest. The media establishment has wanted to put on a good show. That's not in the voters' interest. And all of that is about, let's be clear, all of that is about taking power out of the hands of the voters of New Hampshire, or the voters of Iowa, or the voters of South Carolina. And that's not the way this country is supposed to work. Let's keep power in the hands of the voters of New Hampshire, because guess what? People here take this responsibility very seriously. It is New Hampshireites' job to vet candidates and winnow the field, nobody else's.
And thank you very much, and
Thank
best
you,
of luck
Jeff.
to you moving forward. Can't
Thank
believe
you.
the time is flying, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Thank you, Carly Fiorina.